mode.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our ISO 14001-2015 webinar on external issues. Today we're going to cover a number of requirements within the standard that address external issues to hopefully clarify some of the new requirements in the 2015 version. So my name is Scott Jones. Some of you, I know I've talked to you in the past, may be familiar with me, but I am the EHS Program Manager here at Perry Johnson Registrars. I work out of our headquarters here in Troy, Michigan. I'm a full-time employee here, so if you have any questions at any point, you can always type questions into the question box. I'll do my best to get through them all at the end. We should have 15 to 20 minutes or so to address any questions that you may have. But if you have any specific questions that you want to talk about that really apply to your organization, I'll have my contact information up at the end of the presentation as well. So you can always give me a call or shoot me an email and we can discuss your specific questions then. So again, my name is Scott Jones. I'm not only the EHS Program Manager, but I'm also a lead auditor to ISO 14001, the 2004 version, as well as the 2015 version. I also audit to a number of our other EHS standards, such as OSAS 18001, which is soon to change to ISO 45001. So we'll have some webinars on the revised standard in the near future once the standard gets a little bit further along and is closer to being published. So we'll start today's webinar talking about just a brief overview of PGR if you're not familiar with who we are and what we do. We'll talk about some of the benefits and drivers to getting certified to ISO 14001. And then we'll talk about the status update. So where we're at with the transition process and what are the transition requirements if you are already certified, or if you're looking to get certified, what are your options? We'll briefly talk about some of the key changes before we get into the external issues, and then we'll finish up with certification requirements. So that'll address any of the transition requirements as well as any new certification requirements. So then again, we'll have some question and answers at the end. So if you have questions, type them into the question poll, and I'll save those for the end, and then we'll go through those one by one. So let's get started. So PGR, we're a certification body or a registrar that certifies companies to different voluntary standards. So we've certified companies to 14001 all over the world. We have auditors located throughout the United States as well as throughout the world. We have offices in Italy, India, Japan, now China and Latin America. So wherever your organization's at, we have auditors in those locations to help best serve you. So we are accredited to certify companies to a number of different standards, such as obviously ISO 14001, along with ISO 9001, OSAS 18001, your responsible recycling, which is R2. So that's an electronic waste recycling standard along with e-stewards. And then we have RC 14001 and RCMS. So those are some of the EHS standards that we certify companies to. So for those of you who are not certified yet and looking to get certified, we often receive questions as to why should we get certified? What are the benefits of getting certified? What are the benefits of getting certified to ISO 14001 versus ISO 9001 or OSAS 18001? And each standard and it has its own benefits and own requirements that can help organizations. It really depends on what your needs are. So 14001 really focuses on obviously your environmental, but it focuses on identifying what your aspects and your impacts are, and also your legal requirements. So by identifying those and identifying those legal requirements, it helps to ensure that not only are you aware of what your legal requirements are, but it ensures that you have a plan in place to meet those legal requirements. So we are not compliance auditors. We're not going in there as compliance auditors looking specifically at the legal requirements. What our purpose is to go in and make sure that you have a plan in place that identifies the legal requirements, that establishes a plan to help you achieve compliance, and that you're following that plan. Obviously, if there's a compliance issue, we'll make note of it, but we'll always tie it back to a management system requirement. So legal requirements, typically if you're certified, you have a good compliance plan in place. Management commitment and employee engagement. Anytime you have a management system like this, it gets management more involved, it gets employees more involved, especially when they have responsibilities to help improve the company and help improve the environment. Business management. So a lot of times you may have stakeholder requirements, you may have different external interested parties who are looking to organizations who are more environmentally responsible, so you kind of get that competitive advantage. Supplier environmental performance. So by having a system like this in place, there's requirements to make sure that your suppliers and those companies that you are using are putting environmental kind of at the forefront of their business as well. So not only are you required to do it on site, but any supplier that you work with, you need to evaluate them on an environmental basis as well. That's not the only thing you're evaluating them on, obviously, but that should be one of the factors that you look at. And then providing financial benefit, especially when you're looking at energy consumption or energy-related objectives. Oftentimes you can see almost immediate benefits and financial benefits from implementing energy objectives. Okay, so now we're getting into the status update. We're looking at where we're at with 14,001 in the transition process. So for those of you who don't know, 14,001, 2015 was published on September 15th of last year. So with 14,001, with ISO 9001, we follow the same transition period. They're both released on September 15th. So we have 3 years to transition to the 2015 version. So if you're already certified, that basically means you have 3 years from that date to complete and fully finish your transition audit so that you can be issued a new certificate to the 2015 version. So by September 14th of 2018, all companies that are currently certified to the 2004 version must complete that transition. If not, your certificate will expire and you'll no longer be certified. So if you're looking to get certified, you can still get certified to the 2004 version for 18 months from that publication date. After that 18 months, all companies have to go to the 2015 version. I mean, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for a company to get certified to the 2004 version after that 18 months just to turn around and do the 2015 version basically on their next audit. So they're trying to prevent companies from, one, having to do extra work to get certified to the old version just to transition. Plus, it's very difficult on certification bodies to transition everybody within that time frame. A lot of companies like to wait till the last minute, so we tend to have kind of a backlog of companies who want to get that transition in. So this is why we put certain requirements in place for the transition, which we'll get to in a second. So a company can transition at any time during that 3-year period. So some companies have already transitioned. Some companies will transition this year, some will wait till the end. A lot of times it depends on where you fall in your certification cycle. So if you have an upcoming recertification audit, which is your full system audit, it tends to make sense to transition during that audit because we're already going in and looking at all the requirements, all the processes within your management system. So we can easily identify the transition requirements and the new requirements to the 2015 version during that audit. So typically we don't have to add any time if we're doing the transition during a recertification audit. Now, if you decide you want to transition during a surveillance audit, we may have to add a little bit of time because a surveillance audit is a partial system audit. So we're not looking at everything. But in order to transition you, we have to verify that all of the new requirements are being met. So that's why you may see a little bit of increased time if you transition during a surveillance audit. That's why we recommend doing it during that recertification audit. So during this transition period, the 2004 version versus the 2015 version are considered equivalent. There's no difference if you're looking at a supplier or you're looking at a company and they're certified to the 2004 version. That's acceptable. That's the same as being certified to the 2015 version during this period. So here at PGR, if you're currently certified with us, we're requiring all companies to complete their transition audit by May 1st of 2018. The reason for this, as you know, once that audit is completed, there may be nonconformances that are identified. You may have other, items that need to be closed and cleared out. So this gives us time to make sure that you properly address the corrective actions. We close them out. We can review the package. We can issue your new certificate. Sometimes this can be accomplished in a month. Sometimes it takes up to 3 months. Sometimes it could take a little bit longer. So we want to make sure that every company gets that audit in time to be able to close everything out so there's no lapse in your certificate. So as an example, if you typically have a July audit, if you're going to wait until 2018 to get that transition audit, we're probably going to have to conduct that a couple months early to make sure we get everything closed out in time. So if you have questions on when you think you should transition, what, based on your employee count, can factor into, if additional time it will be necessary for, if you decide to transition on surveillance. If you have questions, shoot me an email, give me a call, and we can discuss it and figure out what audit and when is the best time for you to transition. So now we'll get into the standard a little bit. So if you looked at the new standard, you'll see that the outline, the chapters, everything, the structure has changed within the standard. So same with ISO 9001, ISO 14001, the soon-to-be ISO 45001, which is the health and safety, and any other ISO standards are going to follow this same Annex SL structure. So they're going to have the same 10 chapters. For consistency's sake, it makes it easier for companies who want to get certified to multiple standards, who want to integrate their standards in their management systems. So all ISO standards will be following this same structure in the future. So we start with the scope. We have the normative references, terms and definitions. Those really haven't changed. Those were always there before, and those are more guidelines for the standard itself. The actual core requirements of the standard start with Chapter 4, context of the organization, and go down to improvement. So you have context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and then lastly, improvement. So the standard still follows the PDCA cycle, so we'll get into that in a second. But there's also a list of common terms that apply across all the ISO standards, just for the sake of streamlining it and for consistency, so that you don't have to learn a whole new set of terms and structures and everything else as you get certified to more standards. Before, a lot of companies require their suppliers to be just ISO 9001 certified, or TL or aerospace. A lot of times we see companies now being required to get ISO 9001, ISO 14001, OSAS 18001. So by having this common structure, it just makes life easier for everybody. So here we have the PDCA model for continual improvement. It's very similar to the previous version with a few minor changes. So up at the top you see internal and external issues. So that's one of the main drivers for your management system. So that's why today we're going to focus on some of those external issues, because they're a pretty significant part of this 2015 version. They were always, a lot of these requirements were always there in the 2004 version, but I think they got overlooked by a lot of people, a lot of companies, a lot of auditors. They just weren't stressed at, with as much importance as they probably should have been. So they've adjusted some of the wording in the new standard to make sure that these external issues are addressed. We also have needs and expectations of interested parties. So within the PDCA, you see planning, you see the support and operation, you see performance evaluation and improvement. So that's still the PDCA that you had before, but now in the center of this, one of the core drivers is that leadership aspect. So they've gotten away from saying, okay, you have to have a management representative who's overseeing this and establishing it and implementing it and doing everything for it. Now they're saying, You need to identify who your top management is, who the leadership is within your company, making sure that they understand their roles within the management system so they can filter that down through each stage of the management system process, through that PDCA process. So some of the key changes in this new standard, like I said, there's a new emphasis on leadership. There's now more focus on risk management, emphasis on objectives, measurement and change, communication and awareness, and now there's fewer prescriptive requirements. So when it comes to the strategic environmental management, there's more emphasis on that planning process. So what is going into that planning process? What are you looking at? What are you focusing on as far as your environmental management? So again, that's where a lot of those external issues and those interested parties come into play. Then we have leadership. So again, this is to make sure that you don't just have one person who's trying to filter and flow all this information down to the various departments and staff and everybody. You basically have leadership who is fully responsible for their areas and their departments. They understand the legal requirements, the objectives, the aspects and impacts that are in their area, and they can filter that down and flow that down to their employees. So it's not just the responsibility of one person anymore. Typically you'll still have that one person who oversees and kind of pulls all the information together, but they shouldn't be responsible for the management system as a whole. Protecting the environment, obviously that's really what the standard has always been about. It may not have been as clear as it should have been in the 2004 version, which is why they put more emphasis on this in the 2015 version. There's no statement in the standard that actually says protecting the environment. You know, you'll see things like prevention of pollution, sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation and adaptation, protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. So as an organization, you need to look at everything that you're doing to understand how it impacts the environment. So then we have environmental performance. So there's a shift in the emphasis from continual improvement of the management system to continual improvement of your environmental performance. So year after year, you should be able to show that you are continually improving your environmental performance. So how are you going to be able to show that? Well, typically that's done through objectives and targets. So you're going to have measurable objectives and targets to help you truly show how you're improving your environmental performance. And then it kind of goes one step further into that life cycle thinking. So now it's not just what are we doing on site, what are we doing, you know, at our facility that can potentially impact your organization. So if you're making a product, you need to look all the way from the design aspect of that product. What kind of material is going into that product? Where are we getting it from? You know, are you getting it locally? Are you getting it from the other side of the world? What type of you know, environmental impact does the shipping or transportation of that raw material have? Same with your final product. You know, when you're shipping that product, how are you shipping it? How is that potentially impacting the environment? So you need to look at the whole life cycle of that product or service, all the way to how is that product being disposed of? Can it be recycled? Does it have to be thrown in the garbage? Is it hazardous? You know, you have to look at every aspect of that and see how you can reduce that environmental impact. Communication. The development of a communication strategy with equal emphasis on external and internal communication has been added. Again, they've always had that internal communication piece. The external communication was always this sentence in the standard that said basically you can choose to decide if you're going to communicate externally on certain things. Now that's removed. You don't have an option or a choice with that. You have to communicate externally on your environmental issues. Documentation. So there's no longer you shall have this documented procedure. You need to have documented information. How and what that looks like is up to you. You could have procedures that are built into a software program. You could have apps instead of forms. And, you know, you don't have to have all these documented information anymore. You just have to have this information available in some manner. So typically, if you already have, you know, an environmental manual, you have your procedures and all that established, the likelihood of you just getting rid of all that is probably not very high. You're probably going to keep a lot of that, the documentation and everything that you have in place. I don't envision that changing too drastically, but it just opens it up to more electronic, you know, software and other programs that can help reduce the amount of paperwork that you have. All right, so now we're going to get into some of these external issues. So if you go through the standard, you know, scattered throughout the standard, you'll see the word external. So I tried pulling some of the key things out as far as external issues that you need to consider now when transitioning and when implementing your 14,001-2015. So obviously we start with understanding the organization and its context. This is really the foundation of how you build your management system and what you build it around. So the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its EMS. So basically any external issues need to be identified. You know, do you have customer requirements? Do you have surrounding bodies of water? Do you have a city right next to you? What are some of the external issues that may prohibit you from achieving your intended outcomes? So all that needs to be identified. That's probably one of the easier things to identify as far as understanding what is all going to be included in your management system. So such issues shall include environmental conditions, being affected by or capable of affecting the organization. So you need to look at potential air, air emissions, groundwater contamination, soil contamination, runoff from your facility. Can that potentially contaminate or impact nearby water? So all of these environmental conditions, the type of soil that you have, if it's clay, because obviously if you have a clay soil, it's going to greatly reduce the amount of potential contamination that can go to the groundwater. So all these factors need to be considered. So some examples of external issues which can be relevant to the context of the organization obviously can include the climate, air quality, water quality, land use, existing contamination, natural resource availability, and biodiversity. So and it goes as far as external cultural, social, political, legal, regulatory, financial, technological, economic, natural, competitive circumstances. So all these factors need to be considered in your management system. Obviously some may apply, some might not apply, but you need to at least consider all of them and show that if we come on site for an audit, this is a specific requirement within the standard that we'd want to at least have you be able to demonstrate or show that you considered and you evaluated some of these things. So continuing with provision or chapter 4, we look at 4.3 for determining the scope of the EMS. So the scope is really a blanket statement of what you do. What's going to be included in your management system. So again, a lot of people look at the scope and think ISO 9001. What are my processes? So that could potentially be partly what's included in your scope, but it's all-encompassing. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to prevent? And what's included in your management system? What facilities? What processes? So what potential environmental impacts, air emissions, water, all that stuff? Do you have a water system to reduce contamination on site? You can look at a number of these things that need to be included in your scope. So, and as you go through the audit, as you work with your certification body, they can help clarify and help you kind of nail down that scope and what it should be. So actions to address risks and opportunities. So prevent or reduce undesired reduce undesired effects, including the potential for external environmental conditions to affect the organization. So your risks and opportunities, that's a whole new concept in 14,001. So your risks and opportunities come from your aspects and impacts. It comes from your legal requirements. It comes from any other external issues or concerns or interested parties. So you need to evaluate your risks and opportunities and understand what has the potential to impact your EMS or the environmental conditions on site. So those risks and opportunities need to be identified as documented information so that you have a plan in place to ensure that those external environmental conditions don't affect your organization. So again, environmental conditions, it could be conditions from the neighboring city. It could be conditions from a neighboring facility that has potential to contaminate your property, whether it's through air emissions or soil or groundwater or whatever it may be. So these are things that you need to assess in this risks and opportunities. Controls need to be established for environmental performance and practices of external providers. So controls can include type of equipment, approved chemical list, etc. So if you're using contractors, suppliers that are coming on site or delivering product to you, you need to evaluate that on an environmental basis. So is there a way to reduce the number of hazardous chemicals that are coming on site? Is the equipment that's being purchased or used, does that have environmental, can that have environmental impacts? Is there other equipment that you could use that would reduce that environmental impact? So it could be all the way from energy efficiency to the type of energy that the equipment's running off of. External communication, this is kind of the all-encompassing requirement that says basically that anything that is of importance to your environmental management system needs to be externally communicated. So again, you have aspects. What potential impacts can you have on neighboring facilities, on neighboring cities? That information potentially needs to be communicated to those neighboring facilities, especially if you have the potential for emergency situations. Can you impact another facility? If so, you need to communicate that to them. So the real changes, especially for the external communication, external issues, comes in Chapter 8 for operation. So the operational scheduling and control should pay closer attention to upstream and downstream, and in particular outsourced processes. So this also includes the environmental impacts of products and services right through to the end of their utilization. So again, when you're looking at purchasing, when you're looking at the design of a product or you're coming up with a service that you're going to provide, you need to look at every aspect of that product or service. So before, I don't think most management systems truly did that, and I don't think most auditors truly looked for that. But this requirement has been clarified, and auditors have been trained to look for this now. So making sure that any upstream supplier that you use is aware of your environmental management system, they're aware of what your requirements are, you've looked at them, you understand the service or products that they provide you or materials that they provide you, you've evaluated what they're providing you on an environmental basis to ensure that it's the most environmentally friendly material or product out there. Obviously you have to look at cost as well, so there's a number of factors that play into this. You're not going to just take the most environmentally friendly option or energy efficient option because it's the best for the environment if it's going to hurt your business. I mean, you have to factor in everything. But you need to show that you've at least considered it and included that in your management system. So then downstream, who's buying your product or your service? What are they doing with it? How long does it last? What are the disposal options? So again, all that needs to be considered in the upstream and downstream. So that needs to be documented some way that you've done that evaluation. So we're getting away from what am I doing on site to how do my processes impact the environment from beginning to end, that life cycle thinking. So operational planning and control, communicate its relevant environmental requirements to external providers, including contractors. So this isn't really a new requirement, but it's one that I think was always, not always, but often lacking in the old standard. A lot of companies didn't fully go through this process. A lot of auditors didn't fully understand or didn't push a lot of these requirements. But when you hire somebody, whether it's someone who's a contractor who's going to come on site and it's basically an outsourced process who's going to work on your behalf, or if they're contractors or some sort of external provider, you need to make sure that, one, that they're competent, that they know what they're doing, and two, that they understand your environmental management system requirements, so that if certain chemicals are only allowed on site, or if they need to bring new chemicals on site, that you evaluate those chemicals, that you've done your risk assessment on those chemicals, so you understand the potential environmental impact on those. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration before you allow somebody on site to do any work. You know, a lot of times you may just have a quick job, someone needs to come on site and fix something, but they still have the potential to impact your environmental management system and the environment. So they need to be vetted, they need to be approved through whatever process you choose, but you need to make sure that that environmental awareness is done. So here we get into that life cycle perspective a little bit more. So when you're looking at the life cycle perspective, again, you need to, as auditors, we'll go on site and make sure from the design of that product or service that you've considered the environmental, potential environmental issues associated with that. So we're going to look at the design and development process. We'll look at the procurement process, making sure that your procurement process includes that environmental evaluation. And then communicate your relevant environmental requirements to external providers, including contractors. Consider the need to provide information about potential significant environmental impacts associated with transportation or delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and final disposal of its products and services. So again, it's not just what's going into that product, what do our processes do, it's every aspect of that product. So if you're shipping that product out, how are you shipping it? How often are you shipping it? Are you shipping, making sure you have full loads? Are you shipping partial loads? Obviously, a lot of that is driven by cost as well. So you need to look at all factors, not just cost, but environmental as well. So an auditor can't come in and sit there and tell you, well, you have to do it a certain way, but they will come in and say, show me how you came up with the way that you did, and show me that you considered potential environmental impacts or the environmental evaluation as part of that decision. So that's one thing I definitely want to stress, though, is the standard is not prescriptive for a reason. The standard has sort of general requirements that you need to determine how you're going to meet that. So there's 1,000 different ways that companies can achieve the intended result that meets the requirements of your organization. So when an auditor comes in, we're just verifying that you are in conformance to the requirements of the standard, so that you understand the requirements, that you've at least considered them, you've evaluated the different environmental aspects, the different environmental issues. But we can't go in and sit there and tell you how to do something. So if an auditor ever does, right off the bat, you should know that that's an issue and you should contact the certification body. So here we have section 8.1 for operational planning and controls. So and these items in green are more guidance, they're not specific requirements in the standard. So when determining the type and extent of operational controls related to external providers, including contractors, the organization may consider one or more factors, such as environmental aspects and associated environmental impacts, the risks and opportunities associated with the manufacturing of its products or the provision of its services, the organization's compliance obligations. So these are factors that you need to take into consideration. And then we have emergency preparedness and response. So this is, to me, this section of the standard from the 2004 to the 2015 version has some of the most significant changes. So your emergency preparedness and response plan in 2004 would have said, okay, these are my emergency situations, here's how we're going to respond to them. You know, we may have certain emergency equipment in place to respond to these situations, you know, fire extinguishers, spill kits, you know, whatever it may be. But now it's saying, all right, here are my potential emergency situations. What can we do to prevent those emergency situations from even happening in the first place? So it's asking you to evaluate those and figure out what action items you can implement to hopefully reduce the likelihood or eliminate altogether an emergency situation from happening. So once you do that, you know, obviously there still may be some, you know, potential for emergency situation. You can't completely eliminate everything. So then it goes into, okay, how are you going to respond to that? So it adds that new element to it to make sure that you're assessing it to try to reduce those emergency situations from happening. So now you have, obviously, your on-site emergency situations. If you're in an industrial area and you have a lot of industrial facilities around you, they may have their own emergency situations. So if they're dealing with a lot of chemicals, if they have an explosion, how big could that explosion be? What's the likelihood of that explosion impacting your facility? If it does impact if it has a potential to impact your facility, what could be the outcomes of that? If it's a chemical release, if it's just the explosion itself with no chemical release, you need to understand what those neighboring facilities do and what potential they can have on your organization. So that's when that external piece comes in. So it's not just looking on site anymore, it's looking at your surroundings to see what emergency situations could impact you. And if there's a situation, how would you respond to those situations? So as part of an audit, auditors should do a little investigation or search at the surrounding areas to see what type of facilities are there, to see if they can impact you. If they could, they're going to want to look to see what you did or how you evaluated it and what measures you've taken to make sure that you're protected. So then we get into Chapter 9 for performance evaluation. So based on the extended environmental assessment, expectations for environmental performance evaluations are now also being raised. So this includes performance of environmental objectives, and monitoring and measuring will also include all other corporate commitments and risks in relation to environmental performance. So that corporate commitments, so this could be a number of external things. So how are you monitoring and measuring everything? So again, the standard's getting away from, you know, your management review, just identifying opportunities for improvement for your management system. Your objectives and targets, you know, a lot of times we saw objectives and targets that weren't truly beneficial to the organization. The whole intent of your environmental management system is, one, identify your aspects and impacts and your legal requirements. So from your aspects and impacts, which ones are your most significant? So every company has significant aspects. Obviously what's significant to one company may not be significant to another, but everybody has their significant aspects. You don't have to call them significant, you can call them whatever you want. You may say, I don't have any significant aspects, but the top 2 or 3 rated aspects that we do have, we're going to address. Because the whole management system revolves around those significant aspects. So how are you going to control those? How are you going to reduce the likely impact of those environmental aspects? So what objectives and targets can you put in place around those significant environmental objectives to reduce the likelihood of that impact, to improve your environmental performance? So this includes now that whole life cycle process. So the corporate commitments could be all the way from, the upstream down to the downstream and the disposal of that. So you want to look at the whole management system to see how you can improve it. So in the standard, you have Annex A, which is the guidance on the use of the standard. So if you have questions on certain requirements within the standard, you can try to go to the guidance, which is Annex A, see if that helps to clarify anything. If it doesn't, you still have questions, you can always contact us, either myself or you can contact Austin Matthews, who's the Assistant EHS Program Manager. Either one of us can help answer your questions, and we'll have both of the contact information up here at the end. And then you have Annex B. So for those of you who are working on transitioning to the 2015 version, you'll see a matrix that shows the similarities and the differences between the 2004 to the 2015 version. So that may be helpful for those companies trying to transition. So the certification steps, again, so for the transition, for those of you who are certified already, the transition follows your normal cycle. So if you want to transition on a surveillance audit, typically we may have to add just a little bit of time for 14,001, but you don't have to go through a new stage 1, stage 2. You just continue with your cycle. If you're going through a recertification audit, again, you have your recertification audit, you get your new certificate, it's good for another 3 years. So that process, your process within your certification cycle hasn't changed. The only time you'll have a stage 1, stage 2 is if you're getting a new standard. So for those companies who are not certified, these are typically the certification steps that you'd be looking at. So step 1, you want to establish your documentation. And that's the planning portion. So then step 2 is the training, the implementation, that's the do portion. So then you're going to conduct the internal audits, the compliance evaluation, that's more the checking portion. And then you have conduct review of the system, which is your management review. So that kind of all goes into the management review goes into that act portion. So what did you identify that you can improve on? You feed that back into the planning process to constantly and continually improve your management system. So once you've done all that, then you can go to your stage 1, stage 2. As far as contracting with a certification body, you can do that at any time. You can do that before you establish your documentation. You can do that during the implementation, after the implementation. There's no requirement in when you can contract with a certification body. But then you have your stage 1, stage 2. Any issues that come out of that or nonconformities that come out of that, you have to address. Once that's done, you get your certification. So the stage 1 is a documentation review of your management system. It basically is a check to make sure that you're ready for the stage 2. So once you're done with the stage 1, typically 30 to 45 days later, you'll have your stage 2. So this is looking at more the implementation of the documentation we previously reviewed. So we're going to look at the entire management system to make sure that you're in conformance to the standard. Any nonconformances that are identified, again, will need to be addressed. Usually you have 75 to 90 days to close those out, and then you get your certification. So your certificate's good for 3 years. Excuse me. Following that certification audit, you'll have surveillance audits. So typically they're on a semi-annual or annual cycle. You'll have, if you do annual, you'll have 2 annual audits that are surveillance audits or partial system audits, followed by a recertification audit on that 3rd year. So the recertification audit is like the stage 2. It's a full system audit. We're not going back and looking at the documentation like we did at the stage 1. We've already done that. The only time we'd ever do a stage 1 again for a recertification is if you potentially overhauled your entire management system. You have everything is basically brand new. So in that case, it may be necessary to do a stage 1, but it's very rare that we would ever do that. So we complete the recertification audit, and again, you can just repeat that cycle. That's it. So you're good for another 3 years. So that's it. I just wanted to kind of address some of the concerns that I know some people had with external issues and some of the new changes to the standard. If you have any questions on the changes or the transition time frame, you can type them into the question box. I'll do my best to answer those now. Again, if you have specific questions, we can address those later. All right, let's see what we have here. So yeah, the slides will be available after the presentation. The webinar itself with the audio will be posted to our website. So you can go in there and download the presentation, download the webinar. That should be up by the end of the week. So you'll have that. If you want a copy of the slides sooner, for some reason, you can always contact me and I can email you a copy of the slides. That's not a big deal. All right, here's another question. So considering all applicable external conditions, what are you looking for as evidence that you considered but discounted, for example, cultural? So some of this may not necessarily be documented. It's, as an auditor comes on site, they'd say, obviously, if you're in a historical area, you may have some regulation or some requirements as far as building and other things, or environmental related issues associated with the area that you're in, so that may fall under the legal requirements. But they'd want to know that you kind of evaluated that in some way. Does it need to be documented? Not necessarily. You could just have a discussion with the auditor to at least show that you discussed some of these things. You may have a list of the external issues that you did consider or that you found relevant, and if something isn't on that list that the auditor has a question on, you can always just clarify it with the auditor. I mean, that should be sufficient. You can't document every little bit of everything. You'd have more paperwork than is humanly possible. So, that's not the intent. The intent of the management standards isn't necessarily to make your life harder. Ideally, it's supposed to be as efficient and streamlined as possible to make your life easier. But obviously, there's still requirements and things that you need to address. But I wouldn't worry about having to show that you looked at everything. Obviously, if it's relevant, it should already be documented. Okay, here's another question. At what stage are you required to have a compliance audit performed by outside source completed? And where do I contact a company who does this auditing for the pre-audit assessment for ISO 14001? So that's a good question. So typically for a compliance, it's a compliance evaluation, not necessarily a compliance audit. You can do a compliance audit and that's fine. That's typically what people think of. So they think of, all right, once a year I'm going to do a compliance audit. I'm going to look at all my legal requirements and I'm going to basically ensure that audit it and make sure I'm in compliance to each one of those. That is absolutely one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, you could have periodic evaluations that cover certain requirements that monthly inspections may look at some of those requirements and you could document that you're in compliance. There's not necessarily just one way that they have to be done, but for the typical compliance audit that we often see, that can really be done at any point. The key thing to remember is that your management review needs to have the outputs from that compliance audit as inputs to the management review. So the management review is going to be typically the last thing that you're going to do because everything needs to feed into that management review. So you could do the compliance audit potentially a week after the management review to be included in the next management review. There's no requirement. It just says, typically periodic, which usually means annual, which is typically the frequency that they're done at, but there's no set requirement. If you have a competent person in-house, they can do it. Again, competent is determined by the organization. Obviously, it needs to make sense and and through experience, education, whatever it may be, that the person doing the compliance audit or the compliance evaluation is qualified. If you want to go to an outside source, shoot me an email. I can potentially recommend a few that I know of. All right, and going back to the kind of the external issues, cultural and all that, would that need to be an annual evidence or only once? Typically only once. So you do it once. If anything changes, then you may have to do it again, depending on what it may be. But you know, if you did it once and whatever it may be, if it hasn't changed for 10 years, you shouldn't have to do it again. But if there's significant changes that would potentially require a new evaluation of that, then yeah, absolutely. And that could be external changes. It could be on-site changes for your organization. You'd want to evaluate the potential impact that it would have. So, but again, if nothing changes, you know, technically you shouldn't have to do it again. All right, that seems to be all the questions. If there's any more, feel free to type them in. I'll hang out for another minute. And if you have any concerns, or if you're confused by anything with the new standard, if you want to, either in the question box or shoot me an email with any topics that you'd like webinars on, I'd be happy to take that into consideration as we do more webinars in the future. There's always a lot of questions on corrective actions or internal audits, and so aspects and impacts. So if you have questions on something and you would like to see a webinar done on a certain topic, please let me know. All right, well, if that's it, that's all I have for today. So I appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully it was helpful and help clarify some of the concerns or issues that you may have had, and hopefully helped you understand some of the new requirements in the 2015 version. So again, please don't hesitate to call me or email me with any questions that you have. I'd be happy to help. Thanks again, everyone.